right. Let me just check that I'm live. I have Austin, our fearless leader, probably messaging me. It looks like I am. You folks let me know if you can hear me, see my screen, everything will go from there. Hey there, folks. Let me full screen this. We're going to be talking about the AWS CLI today, and I will hit this button to start presenting. All right, so yeah, I want to talk about the AWS CLI, get you all up to speed on some interesting things, kind of go deep dive into some of the new functionality in version 2, and really talk about some tools and tips and things that you can use to make your workflow better. So I do expect some AWS and command line experience. You'll definitely still get something out of this without AWS CLI experience, but it will be more beneficial to folks with who already have AWS CLI, who already have that as part of one of their tools, and you're just looking for something more to increase your workflow, speed up your usage of it, and then kind of the things that are in the periphery there. I want to go in depth where it matters. My goal is that folks walk away with more tools and knowledge to enable better command line workflows. Really, that's what I'm all about. I do this a lot for clients and kind of getting them set up on different tools. So I think that it's useful to share that knowledge. And I'll do lots of live demo time to walk through these things. Everything I talk about today will be linked in an open source repo at the end. So don't feel free to just kind of pay attention, and no need to take notes or write down links or anything like that. Everything's included at the end, including the scripts I run, as well as links out to all the tools I mentioned. And then one thing is, this is done on my MacBook, so it's more Mac focused. But that being said, everything I do, everything that I'm mentioning today is cross-platform. You can use it on Windows or Linux. It might take you a tiny bit of work, but really it should be totally fine. And then I want to check, can everyone read my terminal well? I think, I have chat set up here. That's another thing. I want to make sure that, this is clear and that folks can see me typing here, because this is a big part of it. So if anybody jumps out in the chat to say, yes, I can read that, that would be awesome. And I'll just wait for it. Brock Vitale, it's good to see you. Thanks for coming, dude. Cool. Thanks, folks. Let me hopping around a little bit, sorry. All right, so with that being give me 1 second, technical difficulties, as always happens on moving around. Here we go. All right, so with that, we'll start off. So hello, my name is Matt Gowie. I'll be your presenter today. I'm a Terraform and AWS consultant. I run a small consulting shop, Masterpoint, that is really myself and specialists as needed. And I focus on basically on-ramping my clients into AWS using infrastructure as code from the start. So I really help them solve that problem, help them solve DevOps, and I'm HashiCorp and AWS certified. And really what that means and why I'm here is, I use the AWS CLI a good bit in my day-to-day, and that's how I have something to talk about with you folks. I'm recently a part of the AWS Community Builder program. Really cool program. There's, I think, about 1,000 of us now, but AWS is starting that. If anybody's coming from that program, hello. But yeah, just basically a way to build out the community. So I just wanted to give a shout out. And then I recently rewatched all the Star Wars movies in the past couple weeks with my girlfriend. So I I rewatched all the Star Wars movies, and then this slide deck is based off of them. So Greg had a great question. What order did you rewatch the movies in? I watched them in chronological order. I was scolded recently for not watching the two films, I think it's Rogue One and Solo, that are outside of the timeline. And we haven't finished the 9th yet, so I still need to watch it. But you'll see a bunch of Star Wars references, so hope you like them. Anyway, what are we talking about today? We are going to go into the background of the CLI very quickly. I really want to kind of cover the basics quickly. Basic usage and configuration we'll talk about. We'll talk about authentication a bunch. Really, I think that's a big part of the AWS CLI and really what they got wrong. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about some advanced usage, some particularly like things like V2 features. We'll talk about tips and tools and tricks and things that you should be doing or using. And then finally, I'll give you the open source repo at the end, and we'll do Q&A if anybody has any questions. One note, I've done this talk a couple times. I'm sure my girlfriend is tired of hearing it, but it should come around to like 40 minutes, 45 minutes, a little bit shorter than our normal AWS meetup talks. All right, so let's talk about this thing that we're all here to learn about. The AWS CLI, what does it do? This is an open source tool that AWS has created that enables you to interact with AWS services using your command line. It's really that simple, nothing special. And I mean, but it's big to what AWS does, right? You can do a lot of things through ClickOps, through their console, but you can also do, I'd say 90% of what you can do through the console, if not more, you can do through the AWS CLI. So, AWS is putting a lot of effort into this. They keep it up to date, documented, and easy to use because it's really important to them. In terms of history, I couldn't find too much in terms of when this thing started. I could find the first commit was back in 2012. It is a tool that's written in Python, and it utilizes the Boto 3 API. Pretty standard. You can find it. It's open source. And yeah, version 2. This tool, came out with a version 2, which was a small iteration, but it was definitely some really cool stuff in there, which we'll talk about shortly. But it came out in February of 2020. I personally haven't seen much adoption of it with clients of mine, at least, and people I know in the community. But that's because version 1 does the trick. I think that it's worth upgrading though, because there are some niceties, and AWS is putting their time and effort into version 2 over version 1, obviously. So with that, we'll actually get into some basic usage and configuration. So I'll jump into my terminal here, and if we look at this tool, this repo that I got, that I will share with everyone at the end of this talk, we've got a few things going on. We've got this scripts directory, which is really what I want to show you, or really what I'll be using. So I don't want to sit here, and if you can already hear my keyboard, it's very loud. I have a mechanical keyboard. I have multiple clients who give me a hard time about it, and friends as well. But I don't want to type through everything. So what I'll do is I've basically made my job easy. So I'll invoke these scripts, and then I just have to hit enter and talk about them. So let's talk about basic usage, right? This is the AWS CLI. We're invoking the AWS CLI command here, and we will skip over this profile equals Skywalker part. We're invoking STS, which is Secure Token Service. This is the command, as AWS refers to it, that we're actually invoking. And then we invoke get caller identity, which is the subcommand. What we're saying to the AWS CLI is, hey, reach out to the STS service, the Secure Token Service, and invoke the get caller identity function and give me back the output. Now, going back to this profile bit that we have here, we are invoking that with a profile. So we say, hey, AWS, as the user Skywalker, invoke this function against this service. That's all we're doing. And then AWS, when we hit enter and we send that into our terminal, AWS comes back and tells us some information. You know, we're the Luke Skywalker user, we're in this account with this user ID. Pretty simple, but you know, very powerful in terms of working with this, because then you can write bash scripts around it, or you can use this to automate certain things that you do a lot through clicking and pointing through the console, and that's really useful. Just looking at, just looking at people got going on. I want to make sure I keep up with all of your comments, but I think somebody else is answering for me. Thank you, Chris and Greg. All right, so continuing on, we can invoke with another command here. We have EC2 is our command, and describe instances is our subcommand. We invoke with the profile Kenobi, and we didn't get anything. Interesting. I wonder why that happened. Let's specify our region. So I know I do have instances in the AWS account that Kenobi is connected to, and I want to invoke with, you know, a different region because I know where those instances are. So if we invoke with region equals US West 2, then we'll actually get some output. Wow, that's a lot of output. That's really ugly. I think, you know, we could do better than that. Let's see what happens if we invoke with output equals JSON. So really all this text wasn't useful to me. I like JSON, I want to get JSON. So if you use output equals JSON, then you can get more information, you know, up in a different format from the command. So very simple use case, just to show you what we have going on here. And let me go into, you know, what I just did was I showed you a couple commands. What I want to do though is I want to talk about, you know, the configuration for those Kenobi and Skywalker users that we just looked at. So this is our repo that we were just, you know, executing commands against. The basics usage script is right here. And I have an example in this repo of the two profiles that we just talked about, the Skywalker and the Kenobi user. So these are in my AWS, my like home folder AWS config file. This is only for an example, but you know, I replicated them here so I could talk about that really quick and how you would configure this. So our Skywalker user has defaults of, you know, outputting JSON and the region being US West 2. Our Kenobi user, the reason why it outputted text was because it, you know, its default is text. So that's, you know, this is the way that you kind of set your defaults for the AWS CLI, and it'll respond to them. And similarly, you know, we had to specify that US West 2 when doing the describe instances command, so that we actually got the instances in that specific region. This is similarly the same thing. I had US East 1 as my default region, and I had to specify US West 2 because that's where my instances were. So this is how you edit this file in your home directory, /AWS config file. And similarly, you know, for credentials, how you authenticate as the specific users that you're trying to use. What AWS tells you to do is use a credentials file that looks like this, where you specify the profile name and then you specify an access key ID and a secret access key. Pretty simple, you know. This is in your home directory, definitely easy to set up, but it's a little unsafe. So the next thing I want to talk about when we move on here is, hey, what's the, you know, why are we storing those files? Why are we storing credentials in a flat file? So I want to talk about authentication. And I've titled this Authentication the Right Way, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, but AWS, the way they're doing authentication with storing access keys in a flat file is, let's just call it not great from a security perspective. And really, they should be storing those encrypted on your machine, right? And what I want to talk about is a tool called AWS Vault. So let's go, and if we go and look on GitHub, we have this awesome tool, AWS Vault, that, in my opinion, this is the way to do authentication the right way from your terminal with AWS. AWS Vault is a tool to securely store and access AWS credentials in a development environment. It's sweet. There's a bunch of workflow improvements that this has. It's supported on a number of different package managers and different operating systems. Very awesome tool. If you have take away one thing here from this talk, it's use that tool. So let's go and see what we can do with it. We'll go into our scripts directory, and again, we will invoke a script. So I'm going to delete an old profile just to clean things up, and we'll check out the help for AWS Vault. So if we look here, there's a number of commands. We can add a profile. We can add credentials to the secure key store. We can list the profiles that we have added to AWS Vault. We can execute a command with AWS Vault credentials, and we can do a number of other things. Login we'll get to shortly, because login is my favorite one, and we'll talk about it. But let's see this thing in action. So, let's say we have a user Chewbacca, or an AWS account Chewbacca that we got credentials for, and we want to add that to AWS Vault. We'll just enter a bunch of, we're not going to actually use this profile, but I'll just enter a bunch of stuff. Once we add, use AWS Vault to add that Chewbacca profile, we can then list our, the credentials that we have in AWS Vault, and we can see, hey, we added Chewbacca, and we have credentials for Chewbacca. So this is a simple way of, adding those credentials, and those are now encrypted in disk. If I want to use them, I need to enter a password to actually get access to them, which is really useful in terms of a security perspective, but it's also useful from using multiple AWS accounts or using multiple AWS roles. We won't talk too much about roles, but I just want to highlight that, I use it a lot for different roles into different accounts. So let's look at exec and how this kind of works. We're going to invoke AWS Vault Exec with the Kenobi user, who I've added to AWS Vault earlier. He's already in here. And we're going to invoke that same command, that AWS STS get caller identity command that we were invoking earlier in the basic. So this gives us the same information. We didn't need to provide that -- profile part, and we were able to correctly authenticate using encrypted credentials instead of credentials that are stored in a flat file on our home directory. So I want to show what this is doing under the hood, and there's a little bit of ugly sed stuff that I have here, where I'm basically, removing secret keys so you folks can't, somebody can't watch this video later on and try and get access to my account. But basically, what I'm doing here is I just want to show how this is working under the hood. So what we do is we do the same AWS Vault Exec as our Kenobi user, and then we print out all the environment variables. Those environment variables are what tells AWS to actually who to use for the profile that they're executing against the AWS APIs and how they're authenticated, right? Like when we invoke this command, we get the access key ID, we get the secret access key, we get a session token and a security token. These things authenticate us with AWS's APIs through the AWS CLI, and all AWS Vault is doing is passing them through environment variables to allow us to be authenticated. That's super. It could be complex to you. It's simple in one way, complex in another, but it's a simple tool that's providing security benefits, and we'll talk about workflow benefits in a little bit. So that's AWS Vault. That's how you do authentication the right way. Again, if you take one thing away from this talk, it's use AWS Vault. So let's continue down. I want to talk about some advanced usage. So we'll go back and we'll get out of there we go. So we've talked about authentication. Let's talk about some advanced usage patterns. The main one we'll talk about is AWS Profile. AWS Profile, we'll jump into another script. I'm going to hop back and forth here a bunch. Clear this terminal, and we'll invoke our advanced usage script. So we have our AWS Profile. If we invoke AWS S3 LS without specifying a profile in the command line, what we get is, it wasn't able to locate credentials. That's because I didn't tell it to use a specific profile, right? Normally, AWS will look for a default profile. I don't have one on my system. It's bad practice because you could accidentally run things as a default profile. But, we know that we can pass that profile via the command line, via an argument, and get information back. We've seen this earlier. Really, though, I don't want to always be passing, -- profile equals Kenobi if for the entire day I'm running AWS CLI commands without that are always going to be the same profile. The way that AWS allows you to handle that is that you can set AWS Profile environment variable. It will pick that up and then read your corresponding credentials and configuration for that user. So if we set AWS Profile equals Kenobi here, we can then execute that same AWS S3 LS command, and we get back useful information using that Kenobi user. It's that simple. When you're storing your credentials in the credentials file, this is really useful. I'll talk about how this doesn't actually sync up with AWS Vault usage and how you can fix that in a couple minutes. So really quick thing, AWS, you'll commonly hit errors with AWS EKS or with the AWS CLI that you don't really understand. This is a pretty easy one. You can kind of ignore it. But basically, what I wanted to just highlight is that the -- debug flag, if you pass that to the AWS CLI, you get a ton of really useful information. So this is what the CLI is doing under the hood. It is going through and figuring out what command you want to run. It tries to look for the credentials that you want to use. It checks your environment variables. It checks if you're using SSO, and it checks your credentials file. And it's doing all these things that you don't get to see, but using -- debug kind of gives you a look under the hood to understand what's going on. It'll show, what's the request JSON body that it's sending, what's the response that it gets, and this way you can kind of figure out, hey, where did I mess something up? Pretty simple, very useful. I've definitely had this dig me out of a couple, hairy spots. So earlier we talked about outputs. I want to quickly highlight the multiple different outputs that AWS CLI supports. We've seen JSON, we've seen text, but they also support YAML. So if you're writing a lot of Kubernetes manifests, YAML might be really useful for you. We obviously have the way to output text. And finally, we have the fancy looking one. You can output as a table, which I don't think that's Markdown compliant. So it's not like you can just copy that and throw it in your README file if you wanted to do that for some reason. But, maybe you use the AWS CLI to generate a report that gets sent via email or something. This can be useful instead of having to build this yourself or build something nice looking yourself. And finally, the last demo I want to talk about in terms of advanced usage is CLI Auto Prompt. So if we go and run a help command for the AWS CLI, we get back a bunch of information, right? Like, this is a complex command. This is the EC2 Run Instances command. And what this does is allows you to spin up new EC2 instances. But it doesn't really matter for this example. But really, what I want to highlight is, hey, look at how many, this is probably 2 to 3 dozen, definitely maybe 3 to 4 dozen options that this CLI, or that this single CLI command takes in. And AWS has hundreds, thousands of commands. So there's a lot here. There's no way I'm going to remember this, and there's no way you're going to remember this. What I really like is there is a way to give you a prompt for those same CLI inputs. So instead of having to remember those things, you can go to this. You can see that you can get this drop-down list of all of the commands that are required or usable, and then you can build up your command this way. And what is useful about this is, like, let's say you're putting together a bash script, or you're copying a script for a function that you're writing in your Dotfiles folder or whatever. You can either run this command, or you can just display this command. So I know that this command wouldn't work. I don't really need to run any instances right now, but I can display this and then copy it off for later and put it in a bash script that I'm using or something along those lines. Really useful. This is a version 2 AWS CLI feature that I really like. And yeah, pretty great. Greg looks like he has a good question, so I'm going to read that real quick. Where do you usually put the export AWS profile for various projects? In the end settings for a particular login in Windows, in your bash RC, or something in macOS? Is there a best practice? So, Greg, I'm going to come back to this question. Don't let me forget, but great question. I have aliases around setting my AWS profile, which we'll talk about in a little bit. All right, so I've talked through some of the AWS CLI advanced usage stuff. And now we can finally get into the, well, you know what? I'll hold off. There's 4 other things that are advanced usage that I'm not going to demo, but I want to talk through really quick. So, wait commands. AWS has a thing called wait commands, where let's say you run an EC2 instance. That EC2 instance takes sometimes 10, 20 minutes to come up. Really, if you have a bash script, you could write a loop around waiting for that command to come up, but AWS CLI gives you wait commands to say, hey, I want to wait for this EC2 instance, or I want to wait for this other AWS action that's happening in the background, and then you can then execute something. Very useful for bash scripts, very useful when you're scripting against the AWS CLI. And can be useful if you're just running an instance and you want to not have to keep refreshing. So useful, look it up. I didn't want to demo it here because it takes too much time. These two go hand in hand: generate CLI skeleton and CLI input. Generate CLI skeleton for a command like run instance that we just saw earlier. There's a lot of inputs, right? You can generate a JSON block of all of those inputs, edit that in a file on your own machine, and then feed it into the CLI via CLI input, JSON or YAML. This allows you to basically create, let's say you had a bunch of IAM policies are a really good example, where you can have a bunch of IAM policies in a directory and you just want to feed those into AWS CLI. I would suggest you use another tool for that, but if that was the way you did things, this is a totally valid way of doing so. And then finally, we have AWS history. This keeps track of all of your AWS CLI commands and gives you an easy way to see what you did previously a month ago, see what your output of that command was, what your exit code was, all this easy stuff, and you can kind of remember what you did previously. Pretty simple, pretty useful. And yeah, that's it for advanced usage. Let's move on to the good stuff. This is the stuff that really I actually care about talking about. So tips and tricks. We're going to talk through all of these things. I'll come back to this slide, but let's start off with my favorite one, which is never log into the console again. So we'll go back to our scripts directory and we will run our tips.sh file. So earlier we saw AWS Vault. Chris, I just saw your question pop up. Tab completion is a thing. In V2, I believe it's installed automatically, like it just happens. But if that's not the case, then hit me up and we'll talk about it. AWS Vault Login. So this is a beautiful thing. What AWS Vault Login does is it uses your local credentials to create a session token and then authenticates you with the console. So if I invoke AWS Vault Login, then it opens up a new console for me with that user that I just invoked that as. Super, super nice. Like I really, I have a bunch of clients, I have a bunch of roles, I have a bunch of accounts. This keeps me sane instead of having to log in through AWS's console all the time, and I think it's super useful. So what I've done around this is there's a really helpful alias that I use called, where I've just called it AVL, where it actually opens up the console to do a logout. It sleeps for a second and then does a login. And why this is useful is because if you are constantly using AWS Vault Login, AWS blocks you from logging into something because you don't, you already have a session. So yeah, I'll show you AVL. What it does is I just got logged out. And I have to enter my password because I haven't authenticated as that Fin user in a while. And that's AWS Vault at work. It's getting encrypted session tokens. So what it did was, this is the logout screen. Because I logged out of AWS, they opened up this. And then now I just got re-logged back in as the Fin user, as my Fin 2187 user, into the console. So really cool. AWS Vault Login for the win. I can't talk about it enough. Greg is asking about timeouts. The same with this option. He keeps getting kicked out of the console and need to figure out that setting. Greg, that's a good question. There's definitely, particularly with roles, there's a setting for how long you assume a role. I believe for users there might be a similar setting for how long a session lasts. I'll have to get back to you on that one. We'll definitely talk afterward. But great question. Let's move on. AWS Vault Login is awesome. If you don't understand that, or if it's not useful to you, I'm sorry, but I love it. Let's talk about JQ for a second. JQ is just a general purpose tool. If you're not using it, you should be. But I want to explain why it's useful with the AWS CLI. So right there, we invoked that similar described instances command that we were talking about earlier. And we get back a big blob of JSON. But maybe I only want to get the instance type of that one of the instances that I got back. Like that's the only thing I really care about. We don't want to have to use some sort of like sed or awk to try and do ugly things to try and get that, like walk the JSON tree, get the instance type and get that value out. We don't want to have to like write a script to do that either. So AWS provides a solution for that. They have this -- query option where you can specify basically a DSL for walking the JSON tree to get that information out of the JSON, right? So we invoke that and we get back our t3.micro. So Pravish, you're asking about MFA. AWS Vault is perfect with MFA. We'll talk about that in the Q&A. Remind me. So we have our query here, and this is great. The problem is that that query is only useful for the AWS CLI. And only that specific command. So really what's problematic about that is that, if I want to take multiple pieces of this JSON response and tear it out, I can't reuse that without invoking that command over and over again. So a really useful tool, and I'm showing a pretty simplistic version of using it right now, is JQ, which stands for JSON Query, I believe, where you can just pipe JSON input into JQ, and then you give it a very similar DSL for taking information out of that JSON, and it will do the same exact thing for you that query is doing. The reason I bring this up is because it's useful in a multifaceted sense outside of the CLI. You can use this in other, like let's say you're using kubectl to get a bunch of JSON or YAML out. You can use JQ in that example to, as well as you're using it in your AWS CLI. So it's pretty useful. All right, let's get back to AWS Vault. I really like talking about AWS Vault, so let's keep it going. Earlier we showed AWS Profile and how useful that can be in terms of, basically this sets our terminal session up for constantly being able to use that same AWS Vault or constantly being able to use the same AWS CLI commands via the same user. So here I've set AWS Profile equals Chewbacca, and now I invoke a command. Now what happens is that it's unable to locate those credentials, right? Those credentials are stored in AWS Vault. They're stored encrypted in my key vault. How do we get AWS Vault and AWS CLI to play nicely together with that AWS Profile? How do we get that same experience? So you can still set your profile. I'll set it to this fin user now, and then I'll invoke a command, and this time it'll work. And then I'll show you why that happens. And really, here we go. I have to enter this password. That worked this time. Now, what's different about those two profiles that the fin user, even though I only have my fin credentials stored in AWS Vault, they're not in my credentials file. How did my fin user get authenticated? And the way that works is if we go back to our AWS config file, we have a credential process block here. And what this does is it allows us to tell AWS CLI how to get credentials for that particular user. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying, hey, AWS CLI, invoke credential process, invoke AWS Vault each time I invoke you with the fin user. Pretty simple, but this credential process attribute is new, and it's very useful. Otherwise, you would have to always be typing AWS Vault Exec fin -- your AWS CLI command, which can get really painful. So using this is really important if you want to use, AWS Profile with AWS Vault. Finally on that, there's one thing I want to mention. There is a AWS SDK load config environment variable. This is used by the AWS SDK, as it says in the name, and you'd be surprised about how many CLI tools are using the AWS SDK. So things like Terraform, GoSSM, now I'm blanking, but there's a number of tools that you likely use, and I believe kubectl, like your kube context user config uses it as well. But anyway, there's a number of CLI tools that use the AWS SDK in some fashion. Maybe it's the Python SDK or the Golang SDK. And with that, they don't typically read your configuration file in your home directory. They just run, expecting that you're going to give them that information. So with that credential process piece that we just talked about for the fin user, you really need those tools to be able to read that config file. So AWS SDK load config, that environment variable, if you set that to true in your bash RC or your bash profile or wherever, then it's really useful for you because it sets you up to then have the same workflow across all your CLI tools. Greg, I see your questions. I'm going to wait till the end for questions because I want to get through this. I'm going longer than I normally do. But yeah, use AWS Vault and use that AWS SDK load config. It's not going to hurt you. It's just going to help you. So let's go and look at help again. We talked about this earlier, that this is a bit of a beast. But if we look at the help for the EC2 tool, we get this man page like terminal-based help information, right? Which is great. A lot of people really like that. And these things, if you don't want to leave your terminal, that's totally legit and worth using. But something I really like, I've set up this function in my Dotfiles repo, and I share this as part of the reference. And this is actually outputted improperly, but you'll see it later. So one thing is that AWS CLI does a really good usefully use that URL to your advantage, where you can type in, you can set this function in your Dotfiles, your bash RC, or whatever, what have you, and then this AWS help function can open up. Oof. It actually opened up in the wrong window for me. Oh no. You can open up, and I'll drag it over. Here we go. Hold on. It's gonna. What? What? Come on. I can't do it, folks. There we go. There we go. So that AWS help function gives you the web page for the help, and how that's useful is that now I can go through, I can see for this specific command, I can actually see in a web browser what I'm doing, and I can go back and actually click through links, which is really helpful. Really simple thing. Definitely, I like it. I use that a bunch. It's my own little personal function, but worth mentioning. All right, so let's talk about the last two AWS tips that I've got for you folks, and then we'll call it a wrap. So here we go. I'm going to close out of a couple of these things, and all right. So let's talk about a better EC2 SSH. I don't know how many of you are using AWS SSM and Session Manager specifically, but that's a really good tool, a really good way to connect into your private cluster and be able to get access to private resources in your VPC. I do this a ton, whether it's port forwarding or just getting access to something that I can kind of communicate with. Getting into your VPC is really important. So what I want to show is, this tool called GoSSM. So let's look at it really quick. What GoSSM does is it reads your, it's telling me I have no credentials because I didn't invoke it properly. So it reads your AWS credentials, and then it will basically provide you an interactive experience for selecting the SSH server that you want to log into. So let's look at that in action, right? I want to SSH into my Bastion host, and the way that I would normally do that, is maybe I would set that AWS profile equals to something, and then I'm using that correct profile. Instead, I have my own alias set up around AWS profile, so I will set my AWS profile to Fin. And now you can see that shows up in my write prompt here. That's all in my Dotfiles if you're interested in it. But basically, I have now set my profile to Fin, and now I can do a GoSSM start, which will give me my EC2 instances that I have in AWS for this account, and I can then click into one and start a session on that box. So it provides an easy way to specifically, jump into a target, into a EC2 instance that you want to work with. And something happened with, we'll ignore that. Anyway, usually that works. Live demos, folks, you folks get it. All right, so now that we've done that, the last thing I want to talk about is Docker. If you're using Docker via AWS, then you're likely using ECR, Elastic Container Registry. And the thing that's really useful about Elastic Container, or the thing that's really a pain about Elastic Container Registry, is that there's a complicated Docker login process. What you basically have to do is you have to get a password, like a one-time password from AWS CLI, and then you use that to invoke Docker login so that you can then push images to ECR. It's a huge pain. I've written like 2 or 3 bash scripts for different clients around it, and you end up doing it for your CI environments, and it's a huge pain. AWS Labs recently came up with, maybe it's not that recent. I knew about it recently, but they recently came up with the ECR Docker Credential Helper. And what this does is it's cross-platform, and all you do is you install it, you install this tool, and then you go and in your Docker configuration file, in your home directory.docker/config.json, you set ECR login as a cred store, and then you no longer need to do the whole Docker login process. You just invoke, or you work with ECR the same way that you normally would with like a container that's stored in just regular docker.io. Really useful, saves a bunch of time, and it's kind of tangential to the AWS CLI because it basically solves a bunch of CLI pain for you. So I think that's the last thing I wanted to talk about. Here's that GoSSM project. I have this linked. And I think that kind of wraps it here. I'm done with talking about tips and tricks. I do want to briefly mention kind of the takeaways from this call or from this talk. Use AWS Vault. I think I've said that enough, but really, really great tool. A similar tool is there's SAML to AWS if you're using the SAML provider for your IDP with AWS. And there's also an Okta one. I should link that. Maybe I'll do that in the repo after this. I would definitely download the AWS CLI v2. Use Credential Process, very useful in terms of making AWS Vault and making AWS CLI fit together nicely around that AWS Profile environment variable. Using JQ, Amazon ECR Credential Helper, and GoSSM, these are all secondary, tertiary tools that really can help your workflows in terms of interacting with AWS from the command line. And I really think that, it's good stuff. Anyway, those are the takeaways. As resources, you can check out this AWS CLI deep dive. I don't think you need the link. I think Austin luckily shared that for us at the beginning of the comments in our YouTube stream here. So you can check out all the things that I was invoking and really get some links to some of the stuff that I was talking about here. And then finally, I think I mentioned this, I have my own AWS Dotfiles repo that has a bunch of stuff in it, particularly some good stuff around AWS and Terraform. But in particular about AWS, we've, all the stuff that I talked about today, this is my configuration, right? So that AP alias that I used earlier to set AWS Profile, all I'm doing there is, clearing all the environment variables that come with AWS and setting that AWS profile. Pretty simple, but yeah, there's plenty of stuff in here. People can check it out if you're interested, and you can go and check out more at my Dotfiles repo. But I hope that was useful for folks. Again, I show this to a bunch of my clients, and they end up going, oh, I never knew I could do that, or I never knew about this tool. So I figured putting together a short talk on it would be cool. So thank you, folks. Thanks for paying attention. Thanks for being here. And yeah, I'm happy to go through those questions now. So feel free to shoot any more into the YouTube chat, and I will go through them. And let me go back, because I know if I scroll up, there were a couple that were good. So Pravish, how can I handle MFA via AWS Vault Login? That's one of the things that AWS Vault does really well for the majority of cases, right? AWS Vault, they handle login with YubiKeys, with MFA devices really nicely. They give you a prompt for it, and it's very useful for your day-to-day. If you use AWS Vault Login, there is actually an outstanding issue with AWS where they won't allow you, if you have MFA, to log into the console via AWS, via the session token that AWS Vault creates. So if you enforce MFA on that action, it's get federated identity or some get federation credentials, because you're creating a federated user when you use AWS Vault Login, and that's not allowed with MFA. So that's problematic. But normally MFA, you can set a MFA serial. If you look at the AWS Vault README, you can learn more about that there, but you can basically set all that up. And feel free to ping me if you need more information on that. I can do probably a better job another time. When Greg was asking, when I use access keys and secret access keys, I haven't had to do the multi-factor authentication. Yeah, so you do need to do multi-factor authentication if you have a policy set up for requiring MFA for CLI access. Requiring MFA in AWS is a total pain. It's really way more complicated than they need to make it. They should have made it something that was outside of IAM profiles. I get that they want to continue to use their profile or their policies. I get that they want to continue to use their policies and have everything driven through that, but it makes setting up AWS or makes setting up MFA super annoying. So I'm sure that Greg probably didn't have multi-factor properly set up for using CLI access. And then Greg, you were asking, even with AWS Vault, do you still have to re-enter the access key and secret access key when the keys rotate? Manually doing this now, is there a better way? So with AWS Vault, they actually have a rotate command where, I'll just show you real quick. They have rotate, so you can just specify AWS Vault, rotate, and I'll just give it my fin profile. I don't need that anymore. So I'll just rotate. It's creating a new access key for me. Oof. Well, I tried. It tried. But live demo, okay? Anyway, you can try and use AWS Vault Rotate. That might help you out, Greg. And cool. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I hope that those tools are useful to you. Thanks for coming, Rock. And then Greg, trying to answer Pravish's question. Okay, yeah. Cool, folks. That's all. We'll call it at that. I hope that was useful to you folks. Make sure to check out that repo if you're interested in this stuff. Make sure to give it a star if you're, if you get some use out of it. Feel free to ping me, via email, or my email is in GitHub. And yeah, thank you all. Appreciate it. Everyone have a good one.